Now, I'm thrilled to speak to my final guest today because I'm fascinated with the life and times of Frank Sinatra. There isn't a man on this earth who can have a greater knowledge of the man himself other than his son, Frank Sinatra Junior, and I'm so thrilled that he joins us today on the programme. How are you?
Just fine, and how are you today?
I'm fantastic because I'm sat here talking to you and I'm so fascinated by your father's life. What is your life like now? Do you still live every day thinking about your father and wrapped up in his music, or have you managed to somehow distance yourself from that and remember him as just your dad?
I never lived at any time wrapped up thinking of him every day. Life in reality doesn't permit that. In my case, I had my own life to lead, which, like all others, has its ups and downs. As far as the music goes, because I'm in that business myself, I am constantly trying to bring about the best music I can. And I believe that that's where I run parallel to Frank Sinatra, because he would not do music that he thought was inferior.
What is your favourite track that you ever heard your father sing?
I cannot answer that question. I've been asked that a dozen times since I've been here. It's impossible. There are too many. There are happy songs, sad songs, jazz songs. It's just impossible to say. There are so many sides that were good ones.
I'd like to go back to the beginning now. What was your relationship like as a child with your father?
The last 7 years that he worked, beginning in 1988, we had really no relationship. While I was growing up, I was at school, and he was executing his career. He was making his movies, making his television, making his recordings, and that was a 30-hour-a-day job. My relationship with him came when I joined his company as his musical director when he was in his 70s and I was in my mid-40s.
So did you have a professional relationship as a father and son then?
Yes, we did, and it was a very nice one. And now that he's gone, these 8 years, those memories are much more dear to me than I ever imagined, even at the time that they would be one day.
You were certainly blessed and lucky to spend that time with him. I have to ask a question that I've always wanted to ask, and I've watched endless documentaries about your father. I've heard good and bad. Was your father a nice man?
As far as I'm concerned, he was. I admired him because of the fact that he was a person who believed in the principle of maintaining one's own character. The things he believed in, he believed in. Things he did not believe in, he stayed away from. He practiced those beliefs devoutly. And I always felt it hurt him many times. He was bruised many times by his non-compromising attitude. If I like someone or something, I am not going to just let that disappear because suddenly it is fashionable to let such a thing disappear. And I always admired him for that. There's the story during the war. The Archbishop of Canterbury asked the Prime Minister, Mr. Churchill, since you stand on the side of justice and civilization, why do you have so many enemies? And the story goes that the Prime Minister of England, Winston Churchill, turned and said, Your Grace, the man who has no enemies has no character. And my father did not mind the fact that his character on occasion would generate enemies. That's going to happen. If you have character, you're going to have enemies. I always felt that the reason why he afforded himself that luxury is because the friends outnumbered the enemies probably by 20 to 1.
He never seemed to falter on stage. I don't think I've seen any tape of him ever going wrong. He always kept his professionalism. Was he like that as a father? Did he expect you to behave yourself all the time? How forgiving was he as a father?
He faltered on stage many times. The trick is not to become such a pompous person on stage that faltering is going to upset the fabric of the program you're doing. The entire thing of his show was informality. His job was only to talk to the people by telling them stories through music. There were many falterings. There is no such thing as a perfect show. There is no such thing.
But what I meant was in terms of his professionalism, he never lost it.
That's correct. He never did lose his professionalism. when I was conducting for him after shows, we'd go over notes at night as to what we did, what mistakes we made. All of us. This is the mark of the professional. As far as his fathering goes, parenting in that sense, I never really thought about it. There are always pitfalls between parents and children. There's the old question, who can explain parents to children? But I really don't know what else to say about that.
How well did you know him? He was working so hard and his lifestyle was so well documented. There didn't seem much time for him to be a father. How regularly were you in contact with him?
Well, when I was a child, very seldom, because he was away at work all the time. And of course, then I got deeper and deeper into school, which then went on to college after that. And we really saw each other very, very seldom. Very seldom. But as the years went by, then I started my own career working, and that took me away then, so the two of us were away a lot. As I mentioned, it was only when I joined his company as musical director in the late 1980s that we really had time together.
Would you communicate over the telephone?
Oh, sure. But that's not time together. That's communication over the telephone.
How was he with your mother?
He was very nice with my mother. He always admired her, And I think that he recognized quite well the very good person that the mother of his children was, and is, even now.
Did he even have time for her?
Well, now that, I really was not privy to the adult relationship. The adults keep their private lives a little bit separate from children, especially young children.
Let's talk about your musical beginnings, if you don't mind. You conducted your father for 7 years, the last 7 years before he died, in fact. I suppose it's not that difficult to work out why you are so musical, with your father being Frank Sinatra.
Well, the two were not connected. When I was a child, at the age of 5, I started studying piano, and I wanted to be a composer. I wanted to be in music, but not in the sense of performing music the way he did. I wanted to write songs for other people, and hopefully one day write orchestral pieces and the like. That was my motivation at the time, and on through college. It was only actually by accident that I got into singing.
Why did you not want to be a performer? Was the fact that your father was so big and so unique off-putting to you?
No, it had nothing to do with him. Growing up, I learned and found within myself that I was more interested in the music, the making of the music. I was more fascinated by the orchestra than anything else. But then again, watching people, watching Morris Stoloff, watching Nelson Riddle, watching Billy May, watching some very, very fine orchestral people, that's what kind of got my head into that direction.
Does it matter how many people are in a band to make it sound that good?
Absolutely it matters. And in order to, they're not actually making the Sinatra music, they're paraphrasing it. They did it more because, remember, we are dealing with a stage production here. I found the live performance what made this program desirable. If we're just going to have these video projections of film or video recording that was made decades ago, that can become a documentary for television. But this is the live stage on probably the most famous theatrical address in London. And as far as I'm concerned, the live stage performance is what made it acceptable and good enough to be in the famous London Palladium. I enjoy the dance numbers. I think they're wonderful. I think those kids that do this show, there are 10 men and 10 women. I think they are the best professionals I've seen in years, and this show takes no prisoners. I'm glad, personally, that I told the conductor the other night, I'm glad that I don't have to do this book 8 times a week, because it is unforgiving.
You said something earlier about the live thing. Your father isn't alive or live. So was that a duplex for you when you got behind this musical and wanted to support it? Because the band is live, the dancers are live, but your father isn't. He's on a screen. That's odd, isn't it?
I would consider it odd on its face value, except recently, within the last 10 or 15 years, it is no longer odd. The first time there was a show of this type, I believe, was the show they did with Elvis Presley's video things. And they have the live orchestra again, with Elvis on the stage. But this is not unheard of. I mean, this show is not the first of its kind. I think it's only the most intricate, maybe the most technically advanced of its kind. I watched the audience when I saw the show. I was looking at them, I watched them, and I found that they were entertained as I was, and that is the ultimate aim, that is the objective.
I sat there and I found it a bit spooky. I very much enjoyed it and I thought it was great, but it was spooky to me watching a man who's no longer with us on a screen singing live to a band. How does that feel to you?
I agree with you. It is somewhat spooky and it is odd, but in this day and age, the technology that we have at our fingertips in this digital age makes it possible. So why not take advantage of it? And I believe that you're going to see more shows like that coming up in the future. I mean, about different performers.
So I gather you're 100% thrilled with this production?
I'm thrilled with this production. I wouldn't say that I would want to see every show I ever see for the rest of my life like this. But as a recapitulation, as a tribute show, I think this one was done very tastefully.
If you would indulge me for a while, if we could talk about your father's time in Vegas, I'd be so thrilled, because I've seen so many documentaries about his time with the Rat Pack. First question has to be, were those days as hedonistic as we now remember them?
What does hedonistic mean in this instance?
Well, when I read about how they would go back to the hotel afterwards together, and we'll talk about Sammy Davis in a moment as well, how he wasn't originally allowed to stay in the hotels, which is extraordinary by today's standards, but that was the case. They'd go back and they'd drink and they'd have fun, and I read stories about showgirls and things like that. Is any of this true?
I would imagine that on occasion it was all true, but not as a regular routine thing that became like a ritualistic thing night by night. It depended on the mood everyone was in. I really don't know how to explain it, because I was not there all that much. When that was going on, I was in college. And it was a lot of fun to see what they called the summit then when they were all together. They had a wonderful time when this was happening. Nobody ever dreamed in that group that one day it would become legendary. You know what I mean? But it was just fun, just a bunch of guys who got together, and they had a wonderful time. Your observation about the late Sammy Davis is correct. There was a time when not only Sammy, but all the black performers could play on the Las Vegas Strip, for example, but they could not live there. Sammy Davis, Dorothy Dandridge, Nat King Cole, Count Basie, Duke Ellington, all of them. I, for example, began working at one of the hotels in 1963, the first time. In order to go onto this little lounge stage, and I was singing with a dance band in those days, you used to have to walk into the rear of the bar area and go up a small stairway to the back of the stage. Next to the stairway that ascended to the stage, there was another stairway which descended to the basement under the bar, was a wire caged in area where they used to store boxes of liquor and the like. When we alternated with the Count Basie band, and this was 1963, in between the sets that the band played, they had to go down that flight of stairs into the wire caged-in area and stay there, where tables and chairs had been put for them. There could not even be, for their pleasure, a television to watch, because it would have had to have been cabled, and in those days cable television had not really started yet. This was what it was like at that time. The integrational picture, which was in its right at the pinnacle of its, shall we say, troublesome point, was right there, 1963, 1964, 1965. And the United States of America, like all countries, has to go through growing pains, and that was one of them, you know. Only later, and it was Sinatra who was the kingpin of that, when he finally got to some of these people that ran these hotels and said, when are you people going to come into the 20th century? Now, we have white people, and we have yellow people, and we have black people, but the money they spend is the same nice color green. And it's time we started looking at it, unless you want to invest in antiquities. And all of a sudden, the message was received, was acknowledged, and things began to change. I can remember going to a place one time in Las Vegas at that particular point in time, and as I say, in all due respect, this was well over 40 years ago. A jazz workshop used to meet in one of the lounges in one of the hotels on a Monday night, usually. And I would go over with some of the other guys, musicians from other shows, different singers, musicians from other hotels. We would go to listen to the jazz and hear the visiting artists who had come into town to play. One night, I was told by someone that somebody had brought up the point, it's funny how we never see any black performers in the jazz club. And suddenly it became, clear to all of us that that was not just coincidental, that was deliberate. And I said, I never really thought of that. I never noticed that before. And one of the men said very quietly, Frank, in case you're not aware of it, some months ago, Louis Armstrong was here in town. They wouldn't even let him play in the show. This doesn't say much for our society at that time. Hopefully we are getting a little bit better,
Final set of questions then have to be about the Rat Pack and your relationship with them. How close were you to Dean and Sammy? Did you get to know them well?
I was on Dean's television show with him many times, and my first movie I was ever in was a movie that Sammy put me in. And I was delighted to be present with both of them. They were both very nice to me. They had magnificent talents. Dean Martin could do more with less than anyone. And to play the part of the bumbling fool takes more concentration than anything I have ever witnessed, in fact. He was really brilliant. He knew exactly what he was doing. He had this great gift of making people laugh. Sammy, there was very little that Sammy Davis could not do. He was a genius of show business, and he was very, very good to me. Both of them were, in fact.
I think your father and Dean did some of the best shtick I'd ever seen anywhere in the world. It was better than Laurel and Hardy, any of those great comedians. I mean, it was just brilliantly timed, and that stuff about him being drunk. Was he drunk, by the way?
No. If he had been all that drunk, he wouldn't have been able to concentrate to do that. A performer who drinks like that, and I worked with one of them. There was a man named Phil Harris years ago in the United States who was a solo performer, and I was his resident whipping boy. He was in his late 60s, and I was in my 20s. But the point was, the more he had to drink, the funnier he was. But there were not routines to be met and executed with concentration. When Frank and Dean would work, they would actually have to keep their heads pretty clear in order to make this, as you call it, shtick, come together. If not, it would have collapsed and it would not have been funny. But to keep it light and airy, that was their whole objective.
A few final questions because we have to go shortly. The first time you performed with your father, was that the greatest moment of your life, to be conducting an orchestra with the great Frank Sinatra, your father, singing next to you?
Well, the first time I performed with him was as a singer. The first time I conducted for him, I told him that night, I said, I think this is the greatest day of my life right now that I can do this. People have been asking me since I arrived in London about that. And I told them that when he asked me to be his conductor, I was 44 years old. And I was delighted that he had picked that point to ask me. If he had asked me 10 years, 5 years, maybe 3 years earlier, I would have had to refuse because I wouldn't have been good enough. I wouldn't have been prepared to do that job. But he asked me at the right time, and as it turned out, it did work.
How does it feel for you, knowing that when you've passed away, when I've passed away, and when my children's children's children have passed away, they'll still be playing Frank Sinatra records on the radio. That is so rare. It's so exceptional. How do you cope with that, knowing that your father's achieved something that virtually nobody else has ever achieved?
Well, I think you're mistaken there. I think other people's music will still be played as well.
But there are so few of them that this isn't normal.
That's true. But then remember, one of the science fiction shows, The Outer Limits, years ago, when they went to the man who was the artificially created human being from 10 million years into the future, more advanced, physically, was playing a Bach double invention on the piano. He said, I think Bach is going to outlive us all. I mean, Johann Sebastian's Bach music, which is 400 years old, is still being played. If Sinatra's music is still being played into the future, I think that's a great testimony to his, more than anything else, his taste in having picked out the music that was a good music in that sense. But he will not be alone in that sense. I think that there are other artists whose music you'll be hearing. Of course, you and I, as you mentioned, will have no way of knowing this. We'll be gone. But I'd like to believe that maybe 600 or 800 years from now, that somebody will still be listening, to his music. What was it that I read recently somewhere? There is a song in English history called Greensleeves. Greensleeves is the oldest popular song in the world that people have been singing that melody for 800 years. So that the longevity of certain music is not unheard of. I think we can expect it. But then again, my crystal ball is cloudy, and I really was never much good at predicting the future.
The word legend is very, very overused. A lot of people are called legends. I think your father certainly was. There'll never be another, will there?
As far as I'm concerned, there won't. No, he was unique. Was it used to Joey Bishop, one of the guys used to say about him, there will be better, there will be worse, but there'll never be another.